Hey, John McWhorter, how you doing?
Hi, Glenn. How are you?
I'm fine, Glenn. Loury here of the Glenn Show, bloggingheads.tv, Brown University. John McWhorter, my compatriot and conversation partner of Columbia University, and he writes all over the place, Daily Beast, Time Magazine, and other such places. John, the state of race relations in America today seems to be a perennial. We had a conversation the last time, about a week, 10 days ago. We didn't have enough time to get everything we wanted to say said. So I thought we might just begin by revisiting that. You had some stuff you want to say, and events continue to, transpire. There was an acquittal of a police officer charged with, I think, murder in Cleveland. The guy that shot all the bullets through the windshield of the car and whatnot, he was acquitted. Cleveland did not explode, and civic leaders, including the governor of Ohio, John Kasich, are patting themselves on the back for having avoided that, but there's still dissatisfaction.
Mm-hmm.
There's turmoil in the intellectual sphere, as Cornel West and Michael Eric Dyson, the New Republic piece, we spoke about it a bit last time. Anyway, I don't know. What do you think?
Glenn, something just hit me, and
What's that?
we did not mention this before as a topic, but I'm sure that you're going to want to discuss it, and it's something that I've decided I'm not going to write about. But this needs to be mentioned by you and me in some public forum. You know that talk about the New Republic, and the official topic is supposed to be Michael Eric Dyson's Jeremiad against Cornel West
Right.
about a month ago now. But the New Republic is now the New Republic. And the old New Republic, which was squired by Franklin Foer and Leon Wieseltier, was basically extinguished many months ago when the new owners went into a new direction, and after a while pretty much made it clear that what Frank and Leon were doing wouldn't be welcome. And just to quickly recap, almost
Yes.
all of the contributing editors and contributors to the New Republic resigned in the wake of that. I was one of those people. I think only 3 people stayed. And then there was in one of
You resigned because of the new regime's change of direction?
Yeah, the new regime,
Okay, go ahead.
quote unquote, was interested in breaking shit and indicated that they were going to be less
Breaking shit.
And apparently that's a set expression that means being novel or
Muscular, going after something cutting edge or edgy even.
But what that really has is a smell of BuzzFeed about it, and there was a lot of talk of typical New Republic pieces being too long and too complicated. And it was clear that what they wanted to do was quite different from the magazine that I wrote for a very long time and liked best of anywhere I've ever written for, and that you wrote for a long time and inspired me in your writings for. I remember reading you before I ever thought I would know you and thinking this is somebody who actually makes sense about race. And so we all resigned, and we've been writing for other places. But early in the New Republic's tenure, there was an article by somebody there whose name I can't even pronounce. It's Jeetheer. I would guess as a linguist that it's something like Yate Hair. But he wrote that the New Republic needed to atone for its race writing in the past. And this was in the wake of Ta-Nehisi Coates, joined by others, implying that the New Republic of the 1990s in particular, under Martin Peretz, was a racist magazine where people like him would not be welcome. This, Glenn, is what ticks me off. Yate Hair, or however he pronounces his name in English, wrote that the New Republic had been wrong in its previous take on race, in that, for example, it had plenty of writers, black writers, but they were people who were conservative, or as he put it, conservative-leaning, and he wrote a list, and on that list were, of course, you and me, and I imagine Deborah Dickerson, but the idea being that had been wrong, and in the good-thinking media...
Got to put Shelby Steele there, too.
Shelby Steele.
Shelby Steele's intellectual obit of Ellison.
Exactly, yeah, he was certainly...
for example, I mean, just, go ahead. Anyway,
well,
you're into a thing about the New Republic, and we're all listening attentively.
Yeah, and so, basically, the idea seems to be that the New Republic that solicited views from people like you and Shelby Steele and me was wrong. that magazine that people like Ta-Nehisi Coates didn't like, that they weren't being asked to write for, felt they wouldn't be welcome in, that the magazine was wrong, and the magazine was wrong in, say, writing about the negative sides of the way welfare was administered before 1996, or any number of things that you and I read or later wrote about. So the idea is that my career at the New Republic was somehow a mistake, when frankly I think that the things that I wrote at the New Republic, none of which were fulminating right-wing nonsense, the things that I wrote were perfectly legitimate. And the fact that the New Republic at that time was not interested in the sort of things Michael Eric Dyson would have written didn't make it wrong. It just made it a magazine with a particular intelligent socio-political position. How do you feel about the idea that the good thinking notion now out in the Twitter sphere and beyond, people make comments about this every week, is that the old New Republic's take on race was racist and a mistake. The New Republic, that has people of the Ta-Nehisi Coates ilk writing for it, is now on the right track. That bothers me.
Okay, well, I can understand why it would bother you. And there was a lot packed into that 5-minute soliloquy of yours just now.
What do you think?
No, seriously, the New Republic is a very important cultural, or has been over the decades. I mean, we're talking about going back to just after World War I. I mean, the New Republic is venerable in American journalism in the kind of center-left political spectrum for being a high-tone, deep, John Dewey wrote essays that were published in the New Republic, okay? John Dewey, okay? Martin Peretz, whom, I knew, lived there in Cambridge, got quote unquote discovered by him when I was a young writer, economist, professor at Harvard, sort of writing these kind of iconoclastic essays about race. And he wanted to be, he wanted me to have pieces in the New Republic. And the first one I published there was December of 1984. Okay. That's how far back we're going. A New American Dilemma, where I was announcing the civil rights movement was over, and I was stressing that the race issue would require confronting behavioral problems within the Black community, the enemy without, the enemy within, beyond civil rights. That was another one of these essays from the mid-1980s in the New Republic. I ended up on the, as you point out, as a contributing editor to the New Republic, and wrote, maybe for, 15 years off and on. Pieces in the New Republic. I remember, having a little essay review of Charles Murray, a comment on Charles Murray's The Bell Curve in the New Republic. For a while, there was something called Hard Questions, which was some idea that the editor,
Is that the thing that was at the end?
Peter Beinart. I mean, some of these people who've been editor at the New Republic, Michael Kinsley was editor at the New Republic. Peter Beinart. These are very serious
and
people.
Not ideologues by any means.
No, but deeply thoughtful opinion journalists who had a very high-toned idea about what they were trying to do. And on the race front, I think there are a number of things to be said here. I ultimately stepped down from as a contributing editor at the New Republic, sort of past the peak of my sort of influence there and whatnot. I was going to say I contributed, maybe every every 4-week column to that Hard Question series with
that thing in the
like
back.
Michael Walzer, Michael Sandel, and other people like that who were writing there. I felt very honored to be included in that pantheon. But I ended up stepping down after 2001 because there were two Zionists, man. That was my problem. My problem with Martin Peretz was that, who was the owner and publisher of the New Republic for many years until he sold it, was that here this venerable organ of high-tone, left-critical American political journalism was, quote, hijacked, close quote, that's a strong word, but was corrupted. I thought it was corrupted. So after the 9/11 event, Peretz had a column called "We Are All Israelis Now," and that was it for me. I deeply resented it, actually, the appropriation of this event to this particular thing. We're not all Israelis. It's not that simple. He had an analysis in there, and I won't go on about this. It was if Um, 2,500 were slaughtered at the World Trade Center relative to 300 million Americans.
Mm-hmm.
That's not all that dissimilar from, 100 people being blown up in a cafe or 75 people relative to 6 million Israelis.
Mm-hmm.
It's the same enemy, it's the same program, it's the same problem. We're all Israelis now.
Mm-hmm.
And, I just turned my stomach. So, but I'm not addressing your question, which is, was the tone of the race coverage in the old New Republic somehow wrong?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Now, I haven't been one of the people contributing to it and not disavowing what I wrote in the New Republic all those years ago. Indeed, I think present day events bear out the relevance of some of that criticism.
Certainly do.
So no, we weren't wrong. And was the New Republic racist? I mean, that's just completely absurd. Okay, that means that you can't have 2 different or 3 different opinions about any of these race issues. You have to check off a box, and that's anti-journalism. So, they may have been right, they may have been wrong. We're going to have to get down to cases and get down to issues. But the fact that they didn't, sign off on the civil rights movement's authorized, whatever, is certainly not making them wrong. Many of those questions were and are, whether it be about welfare, or it be about crime, or it be about voting and political representation, or it be about Jesse Jackson or Al Sharpton or Cornel West for that matter. It'd be about affirmative action, whether it, be about did busing work or didn't it work. People are writing books. The books have to be reviewed. There should be an argument. This circle the wagons, you're either with us or against us. There's only one way of looking at history mentality of some people, we could name names, but who I'm talking about is anti-intellectual.
That is exactly the word
I don't think it survives. I mean, I'll stop, but I only think it survives because people are being patronized. I think most of the serious observers of American politics see right through it, but they go along because it's less trouble than
definitely
blah blah blah. So anyway,
yeah, I agree. And anti-intellectual is the word that I have found myself reluctantly having to use about the genuflective consensus that seems to have emerged around this obituary sense of the New Republic that we wrote for when it comes to race. Because yes, the basic idea seems to be, if you questioned A, B, C, or D in clear language, you were certainly wrong in the empirical sense, and you were certainly immoral in the ethical sense, and therefore it was a racist magazine in that it wouldn't have had somebody like you writing for it, whoever the you is writing. And now it has atoned by having a different kind of political view, when in fact I'm quite confident that what you wrote, what Shelby Steele wrote, what I wrote, I think I've written more for them ultimately than anybody else, and I'm proud of what I wrote for them because it was...
I gotta say something though, John, I do. I mean, I have had my troubles with race coverage in the New Republic, okay? I just gotta tell you that. Some of those pieces you wrote, I can't remember all of them. I remember a book by a guy named Boggle or something like that about blacks in TV and movies of yours. I didn't like it, John. I'm just going to have to tell you. And I have to go back and read it again and explain why I didn't. I can just remember the feelings, and the feelings were not positive. I'm just sorry, John. And when Weasel Tear assigned Shelby Steele the task of reviewing Ralph Ellison after Ellison died, a big piece in the back of the book, as they used to call it in the New Republic, cultural criticism, it drove me crazy because whereas Shelby Steele, whom I, admire and respect, frankly, as a writer and commentator on American race relations, although he's been saying the same thing for 25 years, but then we could go into that in greater detail. Not fair to Shelby. We're not giving him an overall assessment here. But I'm just trying to say he's not nobody, okay? And he was, when he was in academics, a professor of literature. And certainly was qualified to comment on Ralph Ellison. I'm not saying that at all. But as I recall the piece that he wrote, he reduced Ralph Ellison down to the Shelby Steele point. He used Ralph Ellison as a foil in order to make the Shelby Steele point. And I just thought, darn it, this is important. This is American culture. It's American literature. This is kind of my turf. Okay, we talked about Africa. I'm a contributing editor at the thing. I write Weasel Tear and I say, man, come on, man, Shelby Steele. I didn't think much of that review. I don't think it did Ellison justice, and I mean, I got a problem with it, and then I wrote back. He said, "Well, I'm sorry that you have a problem with it. I got it on my magazine,
Right.
which is, it's his prerogative to put in the magazine what he wants to put in there." But I have to just tell you, it left a bad taste in my mouth.
Yeah, I mean, by no means was that New Republic anything like perfect on race. I agree with you about the Zionist point. I also got impatient with that New Republic about Bosnia as well. And there are stories I could tell about that New Republic and race. Yeah, there were things I did not like that other black people wrote in it. You're talking about the first thing that I wrote, however, and I've never spoken about it since. But that was a review of Donald Bogle's Primetime Blues, which was a history of black people's contributions to TV. And you know what? It's funny. Just by chance, I happened to reread that about 3 weeks ago because my hand came across it while I was looking for something else. And to be honest, Glenn, I that was one of the best things that I ever wrote. Bogle wrote this wonderful book in its way where he just took black TV from the very, very beginning.
Yeah, Coons and Mammies and stuff.
That was the movie. Yeah, he did that for TV. And the problem with it was, and I think if you read the book, I think you'd probably agree with me. After about 1968, with the TV show Julia, where Diane Carroll played a middle-class nurse, Bogle's idea is that every single thing any black person ever did on TV is reducible to one of these cartoon stereotypes if you think hard enough about it. Except.
So your piece is coming back to me, Jay. Excuse me for interrupting, but now I'm thinking about the Jeffersons, and I'm thinking about the Dynamite character in the Jeffersons.
Yes.
I know you know who I'm talking about. And if I'm not mistaken, there was an image of him in the magazine accompanying. There must have been many images of black TV figures and mammies and different things like that. But I just remember, what was that guy's name?
Jimmy J.J. Walker on Good Times. Yeah.
And did you not have something good to say about him, about that characterization?
No. In the piece, I actually say, I have nothing good that I can think of to say about Jimmy Walker's Dynamite character.
Okay, because it wasn't stereotype.
No, that was horrible. I mean, I understood Walker's basic point, but his point basically just dragged everybody through the mud except maybe 3 or 4 performances that he allowed pass muster. And I thought it was disrespectful to people who've been trying to do their best. And after a certain point, I thought it was just unrealistic to say that.
And did you extol the Cosby Show as
Cosby Show is
iconic illustration of the breadth of black representation?
Cosby's great, but then of course, does every black TV show have to be as dignified and staid as that one? For him, everything else is just ridiculous. I'll Fly Away was okay, for example. Frank's Place was okay. These really important. But for him, everything else was just basically the Toms, Coons, Bucks, Mulattoes, and Mammies. And I thought it was really reductive and really, it indicated almost a lack of racial self-love to diss that much stuff. And so that's what that piece was about. Now, I understand if you didn't like it, but if anybody read that piece and thought the magazine in printing this, where quite frankly I displayed a very apt knowledge of black television and black theater and black film, if that was just a piece of racism, I think that's an extreme. I'm not accusing you of that.
Well, that's ridiculous. It wasn't racism.
It's very reductive.
Even if I didn't like it, I didn't think it was racist. I just thought it was, quote, wrong. But I may need to reassess that as well.
That was my first thing. They gave me 8,000 words. I framed that issue. I still have it in my study. That was my first thing.
Yeah, did they not have you on the cover there?
They had me on the cover. That's right. And it wasn't J.J. Walker either. I forget what was actually on the cover. But but anyway, the basic point being that all of that is somehow something that needs to be apologized for, I think is indicative of the state of the race discussion today, in that, as you said, I don't think that all of the, frankly, white writers who are saying that they agree with this really do agree with it. They feel like they're supposed to, and none of them are being ad hominem against me. The whole discussion kind of steps around me, which is fine. But there's an implication that, I was the one black contributing editor of the New Republic by the end. But I think all these people are saying that the old New Republic was racist and just leaving it at that. Because they feel like
Stanley Crouch used to write in the New Republic, as I recall.
Yeah, something happened between him and Weasel Tear, and I'm not sure what it was. But yeah, Stanley Crouch, his writing writings
that
are
could
all
be no
racist?
surprise, given the personalities involved.
Both of their, imagine those two people in the same room. But I just wondered what you thought about this idea that the New Republic is correct and the old New Republic is something that needs to be atoned for. Because
I think it's a second-order idea, and people of our quality needn't detain ourselves very long over it.
This is the only time I'm ever going to bring it up in public, but I thought I wanted to talk to you about this, and I just remembered as we started.
Let's get your view on the big New Republic piece, 7,000 words or whatever it was,
10,000.
by Michael Eric Dyson, taking down Cornel West several pegs, and laying down a marker, protecting President Obama against criticism from the left, defending the role that people like Michael Eric Dyson, that's who we're talking about, Al Sharpton, Melissa Harris Perry, who are media personalities and political figures who are in the president's camp, against criticism by people like Tavis Smiley and Cornel West, who have been saying that he's not progressive enough and that he's kind of selling down the black legacy, selling us down the river for 30 pieces of political silver or whatever.
Well, I don't know. The alternate universe version of Dyson's piece would have been about 1,500 words long, where he takes issue with what Cornel West had said about him. I don't completely understand why it has to be 10,000 words of comprehensive vitriol, and I can't help thinking that I think I understand where Dyson is coming from, but to me, that's the second of what there are really two of, because Dyson also wrote a whole book about Bill Cosby that was in the same vein after Bill Cosby made his famous pound cake speech. And so not just somewhere where he writes 2,000 words explaining why Cosby is wrong, although I think he did something like that. But then there has to be an entire...
And by the way, this is before the sexual
long before
harassment allegations.
Although in Is Bill Cosby Right, which I think was 2005. Of course, one of the things, Dyson researched this. He told me that he worked hard on it. One of the things that was in it was these allegations about Cosby. That's the first time.
He was one of the first to surface these allegations.
Especially so comprehensively. That's where I learned about them, from his book. And at the time, I thought, well, okay, Dyson is writing this because Cosby is going right to the heart of the whole race debate, whether it's culture or the structure. But now here we are, 10 years later, and Cornel West has basically thumbed his nose at Dyson a few times. And Dyson basically writes another book. And not just about Cornel West and Obama and correcting him on that, but taking Cornel West apart as a scholar and a human being. I don't have a taste for that, for all that some people think of me as...
Let me just say a word, John. I don't know if everybody listening will know what the pound cake speech is and all that. So this is the 50th anniversary of the Brown versus Board of Education decision, 2004, if I'm not mistaken.
That's when it was, yeah.
And there's a big to-do dinner or something like that put on by the civil rights groups or something like that.
Now, yeah.
And Bill Cosby, famed comedian, TV personality, is asked to make some remarks. And he goes off script. And during those remarks, he basically accuses African-American lower classes of not being responsible, of not taking care of their children. Of kids are walking around with their pants hanging off, of dope, and putting a baby in the high chair in front of a television with a formula bottle with Coca-Cola in it and going off to whatever, and he's just tearing in to irresponsible black people. And in fact, he and Alvin Toussaint, after this,
wrote a book
together. The book was called "Come On, People,"
and it was a good book in itself. I was always recommending
in which they elaborated on the extent to which there's a responsibility amongst African Americans to pull up our socks, pull the pants up. Oh, you want a job? Don't waltz into the place with some kind of pimp lean, kind of with your hat all cocked to this, this kind of...
Although, Glenn, very quickly, and then keep going. That book also was very useful, and it's hard to even talk about it now because of the Cosby allegations, but it was very extensive about explaining how people...
Okay, it had practical chapters, how do you live, how do you be thrifty, how do you be responsible?
Anyway.
Okay, no, my point, though, is the ad hominem character of some response to that argument, like from Michael Eric Dyson, which is Bill Cosby is a bad person. Okay? Not that too many of these babies have been abandoned by their fathers. Not that too many of these have not been abandoned by their fathers. This is what Cosby's saying. They have been, not meeting that and rebutting it. Not that it's not true that too many knuckleheads are running around making it impossible to run a business. I try to open the store, somebody climbing through the back window every time, stealing my stocks. I can't, whatever. I can't send my kid out the front door for fear of what's going to happen to him on the streets. Not that. But Bill Cosby is a bad person, okay?
Right.
So, to me, this kind of ad hominem reaction to the pound cake speech, which is continued in this piece with Cornel West, because he attacks Cornel West's book, Race Matters, from the left.
Yeah, exactly.
He attacks the book for raising the possibility that nihilism, spiritual vacancy, a lack of good close contact with the meaning and value of life, despair, might be implicated in the desiccation of lives that we see in the ghettos and the racial ghettos of America. This was Cornel West. Mm-hmm. This is 1992. From the left, Cornel West. But nevertheless, Cornel West, a spiritual person, a theologian, blah, blah, blah. And he says there's a spiritual problem. So Michael Eric Dyson, also a minister, elects to attack Cornel West from the left for talking about the nihilism. Mm-hmm. To wit, don't we all know that everything that we see that looks despairing in the ghetto is the consequence of a structural bias and a lack of opportunity, et cetera, okay? So now, again, and I'll stop, intellectual exhaustion and vacancy. He, that is Michael Eric Dyson in this case, has no arguments. Mm-hmm. All he can do is call people names.
And, unfortunately, the truth is that there is space for him to, well, I don't want to put it that way. But yeah, instead, it's all about how Cosby is a terrible person, West is a terrible person, rather than the arguments. And yet, the nature of the debate is such that that is considered a legitimate approach to the issue, at least by a critical mass of people who decide what gets into print and how it is received. And it's just, I find it a little confusing in that that's something that Dyson puts his effort into. Whereas there's a part of me that wonders, wouldn't the idea be to be looking for new things? Because I know that Dyson could do this. Isn't he supposed to be learning new stuff? If you're a professor of sociology at Georgetown with a title, et cetera, the idea is that 10 years later, you're supposed to be saying something different than you were saying 10 years before. And I find it hard to imagine myself, I have some feelings, but I find it hard to imagine myself sitting down and writing 10,000 words about what a terrible person someone was because I didn't agree with one of their points and therefore didn't want people to listen to them. When ultimately I think I would rather spend the time going off and trying to learn something new that would help me make whatever my points were better. And I don't see...
Well, I don't know the study habits of Michael Eric Dyson. I think to be fair to him, we should say that there's more in the piece than just a takedown of West for, personal. There's also an assessment of West's early books, which is relatively positive, and a quite critical assessment of West's more recent books, which Dyson takes the position are not up to the intellectual potential that so excited people when Cornel West first came around.
Yeah.
30 years ago, 35 years ago, people thought, this is a guy that's going to really move the frontier out in terms of our kind of cultural, philosophical, ethical, religious understandings. And I think one may be fair in saying that he hasn't done that to the extent that he might have done. So Dyson is making that case, and that's an arguable case.
Yeah, but it's interesting. Dyson's mission and West's mission, I always thought, were similar in that I took it that both of them were more interested in making statements that the public could readily take in than in doing heavy-duty academic work written in a kind of language that only a certain few specialists can manage.
Yeah, if you read some of that early West stuff, man, it's the hermeneutics, is very French kind of.
Sure, but then he lets it go.
Postmodernist. I mean, I'm not sure I understand all those sentences and paragraphs.
No.
And some of that early West stuff, it was dense. Anyway,
but then
it was productive as another matter.
Right.
But I could tell.
But then he quickly lets it go, and it's interesting. I didn't realize how prolific West was in his way until a little silly debate I had with Dyson during some 5-minute segment on, I think, Fox way back in 2000, where he didn't like losing the race, and we had a fight over. Oh, it was over the whole Cornell West controversy when Lawrence Summers, then president of Harvard University, questioned his credentials. And so Dyson and I did a quick little hit on that back when I used to do those things. And Dyson said he's written 16 books and blah, 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 blah. And I had never known that he had written that many. So I checked. And I noticed that, after the first couple, I think it was the first couple, which were written in the abstruse academic language, it seemed to me that he had a public mission, and so does Dyson, from what I know. He wants to talk, maybe not to the man on the street, but I don't see Dyson writing books full of words like hermeneutics that no ordinary person could get through. For a while,
it's not just the words. Cornell, I said this last time we talked about this, has impressed me ever since I've known him, which is over 25 years, as a person who reads difficult books and thinks very hard about them. Mm-hmm. Okay? So he's got, readings of some of the great figures in Russian literature, Dostoevsky or Tolstoy or who's the playwright?
Chekhov.
Chekhov, yeah. He calls himself a Chekhovian Christian, and yes, that's a slogan. And yes, a guy like, I think Weaseltier takes him to task because he wants to know exactly what he means when he says things like that. And, and Cornell has not filled in all the blanks and dotted all the I's and crossed the T's, and he hasn't produced a systematic account. But when I hear some of these cameos and these vignettes coming out of him, I think I'm listening to a really serious mind. Mm-hmm. And again, I don't take any pleasure in saying this. I don't have the same feeling of a kind of awe, of a sense of being in the presence of somebody who's a deep thinker when I read or listen to Michael Eric Dyson with respect. With whatever respect is due.
Right.
I don't say it, ungenerously. I'm just making a candid reaction to the minds that I have encountered on the page and in person.
Right.
In these two. There's too much bombast and too much sloganeering from both of them, if you're asking me. But I just think,
Well, with Dyson,
I heard Cornell would lecture on the Scottish Enlightenment, man. Hume. I heard him go to town on Hume and Smith.
He can do that. Yeah.
Yeah, he can do it.
And I wrote
because he's read Hume, and he's read Smith, and he's thought hard about it.
And he's read. He can. There was a controversy where he was supposed to, I don't know if he was going to keynote or whether he was just going to be a contributor to a workshop on Sidney Hook, the philosopher. And there were some people who were grumbling that he was not qualified to participate in the conference because he hadn't been doing his homework lately. And he had a comeback where he gave a little list of people's names, such as Gertrude Himmelfarb, etc., where it was quite clear that he knew the nature of their work, and none of those people write for a popular audience. I wrote in a piece, it's the come on is why Kim Kardashian can't write, but that's how you do journalism, but it's in the Daily Beast, where I'm writing about the increasing orality of our culture. And I say, quite honestly, that somebody like Cornell West could have a perfectly legitimate career if he did a 15-minute podcast every week or every month where he discussed things in a way that, educated ordinary people could understand, and didn't even make any pretense of being about to write books that nobody reads, articles that nobody reads, that could be a new conception of what a public intellectual was. Dyson, I always thought, was mainly trying to be what you could call a scholar activist. And Dyson...
By the way, this idea is interesting. Again, excuse me for interrupting, but our time is limited. Mm-hmm. This idea about different formats in which a person can make an intellectual contribution. High-toned. Mm-hmm. We're not talking pop culture here, but we're talking about different ways of communicating it, and it doesn't always have to be in treatises. Mm-hmm. It's broader than just this race discussion. So I have a good friend, he's an economist named Rajiv Sethi. He's at Columbia University. Yeah. You know Rajiv. And he blogs. Mm-hmm. So he maintains a blog. He writes 700 words, 500, depending on what the issue, it could be 1,500 words. Mm-hmm. It doesn't have to be. It's not hyper-technical, but it's not free of technique to the extent that technique is necessary to address. And it ranges over all manner of questions, but it tends to delve at some depth into, if Thomas Piketty publishes a book called Capital in the 21st Century, Rajiv is going to read it. And while he's reading it, he's going to blog about it.
Exactly.
He's going to maintain a series of paragraphs in which he's saying in chapter 22, when he gets down to talking about what the French did in terms of liquidating the public debt after the Second World War, they didn't move like this, which is different from that. And what Keynes thought was the following. And this is Rajiv.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm reading now. This is not published. It's not refereed. It's not on the CV as a
As a
whatever.
publication, right.
But I'm thinking, darn it, I'm entertained. I'm informed. I'm intrigued. I'm stimulated. I'm thinking this is going to be extremely valuable as a public good for people who, kid in high school or college who's trying to whatever, or somebody who's just a layperson who's trying to get their hand around or whatever. And I'm thinking, our discourse is so specialized in our respective fields, and all that's good because that's what you have to do to push the frontier forward. But then many of us who are professional economists haven't thought very hard about high frequency trading. This is one of the topics that Rajiv's taken up. These super fast, fiber optic things where you can move from the mercantile exchange in Chicago to the stock market in New York or London, and make transactions ahead of somebody else by a microsecond that gives you an advantage in the whatever. And then what do you do about it and regulations? Rajiv has thought about a lot of this stuff. And anyway, I'll stop. I'm just trying to make a point. There are many ways to be an intellectual effectively, especially as technology.
With technology.
And indeed, what you and I are doing right now might be thought of in that spirit.
And I think what you and I have done over all these years now is not illegitimate simply because it's not refereed and we don't write it down. Technology allows us to do something which I think would have been beneficial, including this podcast idea and what SETI does and many other people, would have been beneficial 50 years ago. It's just that you couldn't do it. Everything had to be on paper. And I think that there are disadvantages. You and I both know. You and I have both written the kinds of papers and the kinds of books that are written only for our peers. And at least in linguistics, I know that books like that, they're a lot of fun to write if you're a certain pointy-headed kind of person. And you do really learn your stuff doing them. There's an argument that everybody should maybe have to write one or two of them. But the thing is, then they go into only university libraries. They're too expensive for anybody to buy. And they're not read even by your peers. Linguists read articles. They don't read books. And even reviewers often clearly haven't made their way all the way through those books. And you start to wonder after a while, in 2015, is there any point to those published dissertations and academic monographs? And I'm not going to write any more of them. I'm really beginning to wonder what the point of the ones that I wrote was. Academic articles are the same thing. At least you can put them up on academia.edu. But really, if we're supposed to be communicating...
Well, the point, I think this is the way the Tenure and Promotion Committee is likely to respond at a place like Brown, is that's how you influence the direction of the discipline. That the graduate students and the young investigators and the people who are doing the discovery, the experiment, the analysis, the theorizing, the synthetic, etc., putting forward hypotheses, developing different discourses of analysis and so forth, that rarefied activity, that specialized activity, is like the gold standard of knowledge production, and the thing that only a few people read, only a few people need to read it. only a few people are going to benefit from reading it. So I mean, I think there are just many paths in the forest. That's one of them. I don't preclude it. It may not be for you or at this stage of my career either for me.
I'm inclined to think that that's definitely true of the articles, but I've had an experience in linguistics that really has made me wonder. Long story short, I picked up from various people who had made the point much better before me that English grammar, the way we express ourselves, is due in considerable part to the way the people who lived on the island before English speakers came spoke. They spoke Celtic languages like Welsh and Irish. And I picked up from this school of thought that had not gotten around much that English is a very Celtic way of speaking and all sorts of things that we say that are very ordinary. And that's all I need to say about that. But I thought, that's a really interesting idea, and I did academic work on it where I decided I'm going to be an American writing for large publishers who actually gets us across to linguists. So I wrote an article, and I had it refereed, and I got the criticism, and I wrote that article, and God, I imagine a few hundred people have read it at this point, but that's all that was going to happen. Then I wrote a pop book, a trade book called Our Magnificent Bastard Tongue, and for some reason that book has actually sold pretty well. It's through that book that the whole Celtic idea about English is now much more influential in academia among linguists than my little article would ever have been. And I think it's partly because books get around even more through blogs, et cetera, et cetera. And it really made me think, what was the point even of writing the academic article if I can write an intelligent trade book and have academics listening to that more than they would the article, because frankly the trade book is more fun to read. I don't know if there's an equivalent to that in economics, but in linguistics it looks like that sometimes over the past 10 or 15 years.
Let's talk about something else, John. I think we got other stuff on our agenda now.
Okay, what was the next thing?
Well, you wanted to revisit the Manhattan Institute conference that we both attended a few weeks ago, occasioned by the 50th anniversary of the Moynihan Report, Daniel Patrick Moynihan and the Negro Family, and which was the occasion of a revisiting with the Manhattan Institute of yourself, where you had once been employed there, and of myself revisiting with a group of relatively conservative social policy types talking about race. And you had other things you want to say about that. So that's one thing. But if there are other things, I mean, as I say, this police officer was acquitted in Cleveland. Cleveland didn't explode, whatever. But I mean, I'm not trying to tell you what to talk about.
Cleveland was interesting. I'd like to see some more things said about it before I had any particularly interesting response. But about the Manhattan Institute conference, I was just thinking in the wake of our last discussion that I spent my time there saying that we need to end the war on drugs because the black market economy that creates is always a temptation for black men dealt a bad hand. And if you took away the war on drugs, then it would be much less likely that a black man in a poor neighborhood going to a bad school would decide to drop out of school and make money, quote unquote, on the side, rather than finding work that was available. Which
you mean that there's nothing else illegal that this person could do? There's no other hustling options? Or there are so many in the drug trade that if you were to legalize drugs and then make it not a black market so that you could, make extra money by,
Well, people could do some other stuff, just as there were always black people in poor neighborhoods who did some other stuff. But the idea of it being a long-standing, dominant, alternate economy that is a keystone of getting by, that would end. And I think that would do an awful lot towards...
Well, I don't think you've thought it through, John. What did you mean by legalizing drugs? Because there's still going to be a regulatory regime and there still might be profit in evading it. I mean, for example, there's an illegal market in OxyContin now. OxyContin is not illegal. You just need a prescription to get it. Not everybody has one. If I break into a pharmacy and steal some and then I can supply the opioid to people, whatever.
Would that?
I mean, I think does it mean that if you're under a certain age you can't get it? That if you have if you were in jail and you got out, you can't get it? Because to the extent that you have regulation, you're going to have an incentive for people to evade that regulation, etc. Are you going to tax it? If you tax it, then there will be the tax-free discounted price market where people evade, etc. So I'm not sure you've thought it through.
But I have thought it through, and it's a matter of degree. All those things are certainly true, but would those things be as large a market as drugs are now, where there's as much as a 413% markup on, for example, heroin, because of the fact that it's illegal? That's actually documented. So the point is not whether some people could get by operating outside the law. They always will. But the issue is whether or not slinging on the corners would be something that anybody could easily do and get their foot into the door of. Would it be as dominant? Would it have as much of an effect on a community as the war on drugs has had? And
what I would say is I think we know the direction of the effect. If you were to eliminate the prohibition regime on drugs, you would have less entanglement in illegal trafficking than you now have. I don't think we know the magnitude of the effect, but more importantly, I don't think we know the relative magnitude of the effect. And by relative, I mean compared to the cost, because the legalization will also carry cost in terms of increased addiction and such and such like that. So these are all questions to which numbers would have to be put. There's no way that you and I just sitting here, I think, will be able to resolve whether or not it would be a good or a bad thing to do. Maybe at best, I would credit you with proposing something that's worth investigating.
And of course, that's fine.
But I don't think you know that it would be a good thing to do, because I don't think the facts are in on that. But anyway, I'll allow you to rebut.
There is no way to, quote unquote, know. Nobody could know the extent to which addiction rates might rise. But as I said, the Manhattan Institute, to the extent that they'd probably rise some, I would say, and I mean this straight, that would be tolerable collateral damage if we could establish that there was a reasonable expectation that the elimination of that law would have a significant effect on poor black communities, especially because, talk about incentive, and that's a concept that you and I both have written a lot about. If we're going to learn how to get people off of stuff, and if we're going to learn how to make it so that society offers that to as many people as possible, then one incentive would be if these rates were rising and we had a new legal context in which we might want to really address this sort of thing for society's good. And for whatever it's worth, alcohol addiction did not rise anything like significantly after Prohibition was ended, despite the fact that liquor was seen as sexier at the time.
Well, what I want to say here is, no, you and I don't know the answer to these questions about what the effects would be. But no, I don't think it's in principle not knowable. I think that's what research is for.
But how would you know that?
I think that's what a literature is for. Excuse me.
I mean, how would you? I didn't mean that. How would you find out what addiction rates rise could be? How could you?
Well, again, John, one would have to think about it, and one would have to look at what the available data and historical evidence are. I'm not an expert on this, but I have seen many social scientific analyses of questions of this kind, to which often not definitive answers have been given, but at least quantitative brackets have been elaborated in which you can get some sense of what the relative magnitudes are. Mm-hmm. So, for example, maybe I got variation over time or across jurisdictions like states in the severity of or the timing of the incidence of one or another dimension of prohibition. Mm. Maybe some states have drug courts and other states don't have drug. Maybe some states have 20-year mandatory, maybe other states have 5, whatever. I'm making this up. Mm-hmm. And then maybe that variation could be used to associate it with, and then a whole analysis would have to be undertaken. But this is why they have those specialized journals. Mm-hmm. And this is why people get grants from the National Science Foundation and spend 2 years or 5 years with a group of collaborators gathering the data and analyzing it. I don't think there's any substitute for that. Mm-hmm. I think our guesses and our hunches are the beginning of trying to answer these policy questions, not the end. I think the effect that you identified, which is if we didn't have such an illegalized regime in drugs, there wouldn't be so many opportunities for guys to go off and women, but more men than women, off the track in terms of getting caught up in the drug economy. Not implausible, certainly worth including in the analysis. So,
mm-hmm. And I think Europe could help us in that there are degrees of decriminalization and legalization that are happening in, for example, countries like Portugal. And so far, the sky has not fallen in any of those countries yet. Now, of course, complete legalization of all drugs, that is an extreme. And the kind of data that you're talking about, especially comparative, doesn't exist yet. But I definitely think that it's worth the conversation for the reasons that we have done to death, which is that how do you make a culture change by advocating for it? And with the Manhattan Institute, I realized something about that conference, which is that nobody jumped me. You just, had your criticisms, which are well received, and some of those things were said to me at the conference. They've been said to me for 6 years now. But I get the feeling that I may have made the wrong noise. I think I brought the wrong musical instrument. I've read a couple of coverages of the conference, and I think about what it was like to be there. I had a great time. But I get the feeling what I was really supposed to do was talk about the dissolution of the family and what we're supposed to do about that. And Glenn, I'm not going to do that. And I hope people can realize that that is not a message they can count on from me. Because with all due respect to you, I can't see any such families changing their habits as the result of something somebody tells them they ought to do. And so I guess I've become, unpopular in yet another.
Oh, no, I think it's much more amorphous than that. I don't think it's a straight line, somebody gives a speech or a sermon and then people start living differently. I think it's like trying to influence the zeitgeist, So, the complete revolution of attitudes about sexual liberation and homosexuality, for example, mm-hmm. began not with people telling people stuff and then them changing, but with, the conversation changing a little bit at a time. Mm-hmm. And I think, carving out space for somebody who, this is going back to our previous conversation, but affirms the sort of, Protestant virtues of thrift and industry and chastity and, mm-hmm. Decency, that we were talking about, what was it, the politics of respectability. Yeah. Respectability politics, I'm saying it's not all bad. respectability is actually a pretty good thing, especially for people who labor under the burden of negative stereotypes. How I thought there's a kind of incoherence in some of the advocacy against, the tacit racism of stereotypes. You look at a black man, you think he's a criminal and whatnot, and at the same time saying, don't worry about whether or not the image that you put forward is clean cut. Why should I have to defer to the sensibility of some suburban middle class white person?
Exactly.
Why should I want kids to present themselves in a way that is a positive and not a negative or something like that? I shouldn't have to do that. Well, you're worried about what people think about you, and yet you don't want to invest in disciplining your own ranks so as to make a respectable presentation. I think somehow there's a disconnect there in my mind.
No, there isn't, because these people think that we need to reconsider our whole notion of what respectability is. When
an African American criminal commits a vicious act, as apparently happened in this case that I know you've probably read about or seen on television, where some family house invasion or something. Mm-hmm. Do you know what I'm talking about? I wish I could remember the particulars. I thought it was in the District of Columbia. But in any case, when an African American, and then so there's an alleged assailant.
Okay? Oh, the Washington case, yes.
Yeah, you turn on the television and you see the image, okay? Mm-hmm. You see an image of a black guy, looks like somebody you don't want to run into in a dark alley in the middle of the night, Mm-hmm. And then the crime is horrific if he did it, And every time I pick up the newspaper and I read about white cop, black victim, I worry that licenses the unspoken thought in the mind of anybody else who picks up the same newspaper and turns the page, white victim, black thug. Mm-hmm. Okay. Now, you thought police out there can tell me that just like the N word, I'm not supposed to use the T word. Mm-hmm. Okay. You can rail against me. Using the T word is the same. You can do all of that. That does not change the subliminal imprint of this wild-eyed, fierce-looking, very dark-skinned, jolly, dangerous-looking.
Jolly.
Yeah. Well, I'm making it all up. It's a composite. Maybe I'm looking in the mirror. In any case, that doesn't change the subliminal thought in somebody's mind that this is the face of urban danger here.
Yeah.
Okay? And it's a black face. Okay? So the idea that I would want fewer such faces broadcast on the news, and maybe I got to go to the news station and ask them to change their formatting, but I certainly want to try to get some of these young guys to not do some of this stuff. That leaves the impression that they are a dangerous lot. Where did I go wrong? All I did was acknowledge that some of these antisocial behaviors by people of color make it harder for other people of color to be free of suspicion. That's just a statement of fact.
Glenn, this is a rare time, though. You don't realize how profound the problem is, though, which is why I want something as weird as an end run and talk about ending the war on drugs. I don't know if you've noticed over the past about 20 years now the difference in the semiotics of the image of the person you just talked about. Because you're thinking about this dreadlocked, snarling, chip on the shoulder person.
Yeah, you're better at this kind of descriptive thing than I am.
But I know what you mean.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking
You're
about.
Thinking about that person, roughly that person, rap iconography enshrines that person. But that's the point I'm about to make. You look at that person as what we might call thug. So do a great many, we might stereotype them, but suburban white Americans. But if you take never mind black America, even a lot of white blue America under about the age of 40 at this point, sees exactly that person that you mentioned as the coolest thing in the world. And you see this thug, but and I don't take this wrong, but you're looking at that person through the eyes of roughly 1985. For people who are younger than that, notice I'm not under 40, but I have noticed that person's bodily carriage, certainly the hair, the way he talks, his attitude towards bourgeois society. The ideology these days is such that that person is seen as cool and as something to imitate. And to the extent that he's thought of as scary, it's a feeling you're supposed to tamp down. It's considered.
I don't think there's anything new in that, John. I agree with you that that is also going on, but I don't think there's. It could be both. I don't think there's anything. I think that the John Dillinger type of figure who has been romanticized in American film and whatnot. I'm talking about prohibition and gangsterism and whatnot like that. These characters played by the likes of the
No, you're missing my point. You're missing my
that.
point. No, it's not that they romanticize him as a gangster. I mean that that person is mainstreamed now. That person is now thought of as just an ordinary guy in the eyes of many ordinary people. He's not considered threatening, or anybody who would be threatened by him is seen as missing the point. He's just a guy. Nobody sees anything, not nobody. Increasingly, there's a set of people who see nothing wrong with him. They're not romanticizing him as a villain. That's just...
Well, to the extent that in the popular culture, some of the affect of and modes of self-presentation, swagger, language, that you might associate with, quote, the underworld, close quote, comes to be cool, comes to be seen as cool, as culturally innovative, as hip. Then it could get assimilated. And you mentioned rap music, and of course that's going to be one of the venues where this is happening.
Call it James Dean and
to the extent that it gets assimilated, and then, here's the kid across the street, he's wearing dreadlocks, and he's wearing this kind of clothing, and I can hear his music, and yeah, I know he's a decent kid. His parents are middle class.
Exactly.
He's going to college, whatnot. He's not a gangster, so gangsterism in this...
And increasingly that person is white.
Separated from one another and so forth. So I don't know. Maybe
and it's not only the middle class black kid who is increasingly like that, and it doesn't mean anything to a lot of people. White guys, including the dreadlocks, the way they carry themselves. It's the sort of white guy who now meets me and is proud that he's blacker than me. And in a way, culturally, he is. And I'm just saying that the way you're seeing that guy, where you think, that image is problematic. It's at the point where a lot of the people who would be poised to do anything about it are in love with that guy. And so it's increasingly harder to make a statement that something needs to be changed. I don't know. I might not be making myself.
Yeah, I want to talk about myself for a minute.
Okay.
I'm going on a sabbatical leave, so this is like a declaration. I have a sabbatical leave coming. I just taught my last class for 12, maybe even 15 months.
Wow.
I'm going to Palo Alto, California, to the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences out there, where I will be a fellow for a year.
That's paradise.
John, I got a project, and I'm excited about my project, which is a memoir. Yes, you heard it right. I'm going to write a kind of autobiographical reflection on my intellectual, political, personal, spiritual journey over the last, beginning in Chicago in the 1960s, maybe even in the 1930s, since my folks came from Brookhaven, Mississippi, up to Chicago after World War I, and the generation my grandparents came, and then my parents' generation, which were interesting and varied and whatnot. They were born in the 1920s and 30s, and then I was born in 1948, coming along to Chicago. Getting to MIT as a graduate, and I could go on like that. I don't want to bore people, but I want to whet their appetites because I'm really excited about it. It has a personal significance to me of taking this on, and I'm taking it on as seriously as any piece of mathematical economics that I ever tried to do. I mean, I think it's a big intellectual problem. How to structure, how to render, how to convey, how to explain. And whatnot. And so I'm keeping a notebook, I'm remembering. I have a whole raft of anecdotes and stories about Clarence Thomas and Bill Bennett and William Crystal. And you mentioned Gertrude Himmelfarb and Irving Crystal, whom I knew, and Nathan Glazer and Erwin Butkus, the publisher at the Free Press, and Marty Peretz, taking me out to lunch when I was a young whippersnapper.
All those
in
names
Cambridge
sound like white wine to me. They remind me of drinking white wine. Go ahead.
Yeah. The time I made Coretta Scott King cry at some meeting because I had such conservative opinions coming out of such a nice little black boy.
You're going to write a book.
The time Clarence Thomas got mad at me and almost threw me out of his chambers because I was equivocating on the affirmative action question.
Oh, wow.
You know, I mean, it was a matter of principle to him. And, you know, he had laid down his marker, and it was Proposition 209, 1996, and I wasn't going to go out and campaign against Proposition 209. Me and Shelby Steele kind of stopped talking to each other about that. Alex Gale and Stephen Thunstrom literally cut me off and wouldn't speak to me after I wrote a review of their book that was published in the Atlantic Monthly in the 1990s. I remember that.
That's right. Yeah.
And so on and so on and so forth. Many stories to tell. Oh, here's one. It's 1987. It's the bicentennial year of the U.S. Constitution. Thurgood Marshall is in Hawaii. He gives a speech where he takes on Antonin Scalia.
87.
87. Okay. This is the bicentennial year of the U.S. Constitution.
Oh, the Constitution. Okay, go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, U.S. Constitution ratified in 1787. And Marshall gives the speech where he basically takes on the original the original intent of the framers' theory of constitutional interpretation, where you're supposed to be trying to figure out what so this was Scalia and others and Rehnquist and Marshall was against this, and he gives this speech, Only Black Justice in the History of the U.S. Supreme Court. And the speech says the Constitution was flawed from the very beginning, and we've been fixing it for 200 years. Okay, 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, for example, the amendment that gives the franchise to women in the elections, and other things of this sort. We've been fixing the Constitution for these 200 years. And I just so happen I've been interviewed by William Bennett to be the Deputy Secretary of the Department of Education in the second Ronald Reagan administration. And I'm in his office. And news of this speech comes in. One of his aides comes in, and they're all upset. And Bill Kristol is there, and everybody's sitting around, and we're kind of glad-handing and being conservative and everything. And Bill Bennett goes ballistic. You know, how dare a sitting Supreme Court justice diss the Constitution in its bicentennial? He basically accuses Thurgood Marshall of being unpatriotic. Okay? Now, the thing is, I don't agree with Bill Bennett. And as conservative as I was, I could see what Thurgood Marshall was saying. In fact, he was obviously right as far as I could tell. Okay? So now I'm getting ready to go to work as the number 2 person in this. I'm getting ready to join this pantheon of conservative political, type. This is 1987, man. These guys are running the Republican Party. Okay? And I don't speak up, John. I consciously bite my tongue. Okay? So the confession here has to do with integrity, and it has to do with being black in certain kind of circles. And and exactly what are you supposed to do there? Okay. Now that was a moment of truth for me, because if you don't speak then, you don't speak. You see, by going along with that, you're buying into something. It's soul killing. You see where I'm going with that.
Yeah. Those sorts of moments, and I had one or two.
I don't doubt it.
They make you think, and I'm pretty sure that I didn't have any where I didn't say something in public that I would have said. But yeah, those moments where you're sitting there not saying anything, and you know that the ideal version of you would have. Yeah, they gnaw at you, hopefully, and they keep you on the right track and maybe make you change your affiliations after a while.
Well, we pay a price, but I would say you pay a price. It's not just the loneliness of the black conservative who has to sell out his ethnic loyalty in order to get ahead. I mean, everybody is paying some kind of price. There are all these different kind of compromises. And surely on the left, there are these compromises as well. So anyway, thanks for letting me get that personal note about what I'm going to be doing next year.
That's important. And my wife and little girls are now back in the house.
Okay.
So it's going to start getting very noisy very soon.
Let's sign off. Thanks for talking, John. We'll do it again in, a month or so.
I am around. And good luck with the memoir. Talk to you soon.
Yeah, take care.
Great.
Bye.